The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat in the sterile waiting room of Meadowbrook Care Facility, clutching a small overnight bag that contained what my son Bradley considered the essentials of my life: 3 changes of clothes, my reading glasses, and the worn leather journal I'd kept for 30 years. Everything else, he'd assured me, would be taken care of. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I never imagined that at 72, after building a life of purpose and meaning, I'd find myself reduced to the contents of a single bag. But perhaps what stung most wasn't the suddenness of it all. It was the casual efficiency with which Bradley had arranged everything, as if placing his mother in a care facility was just another item to check off his busy executive's to-do list. The intake coordinator, a pleasant woman named Susan with kind eyes and a practiced smile, guided me through the paperwork. Dr. Mitchell's son was very thorough with the arrangements, she said, her voice carrying the gentle tone reserved for the elderly and confused. He's already handled the financial details and medical authorizations. You're very fortunate to have such an attentive family. Fortunate. The word echoed in my mind as I signed document after document, each one feeling like another door closing behind me. Bradley hadn't asked what I wanted. He'd simply informed me that this was the best option for everyone involved. His wife, Jessica, had nodded sympathetically beside him, occasionally touching his arm in a gesture of supportive agreement. They'd made it sound like they were doing me a favor. The phone call had come 3 days earlier, interrupting my morning routine of coffee and crossword puzzles in my downtown Chicago apartment. I'd been living independently for the 8 years since Harold passed, managing just fine despite Bradley's increasingly frequent observations about my declining capabilities. I paid my bills on time, maintained my health, and kept active with my volunteer work at the Children's Literacy Program. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. "Mom, we need to talk," Bradley had said without preamble. His voice carried that particular blend of authority and impatience I'd come to associate with his professional demeanor. "Jessica and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to consider your options." My situation? As if I were a problem that needed solving rather than a person living her life. He'd arrived the next afternoon with Jessica and a folder full of brochures featuring smiling, elderly people engaged in crafts and gentle exercise. Meadowbrook Care Facility, he explained, was one of the finest in the Midwest. Private rooms, excellent medical care, social activities. All the things I supposedly needed but hadn't realized I was missing. The waiting list is usually months long, Jessica had added, her manicured fingers smoothing the glossy pages. But Bradley pulled some strings through his hospital connections. They had a last-minute opening. I listened to their presentation with growing bewilderment. When had I become so helpless in their eyes? When had my independence transformed into a burden that required professional management? I'd raised questions about my apartment lease, my volunteer commitments, my weekly bridge game with Eleanor and the others, but they'd already thought of everything. The lease would be terminated, my obligations would be explained, my friends would understand. Everything had been decided. My consent was apparently just a formality. But it was the conversation I'd accidentally overheard that truly shattered whatever illusions I still held about their motivations. I'd been in the kitchen making tea when Bradley's phone rang. He'd stepped onto the balcony to take the call, not realizing that the old windows conducted sound better than he imagined. "No, Richard, she's finally agreed to the facility," he'd said, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. "It took some convincing, but she's signing the papers tomorrow." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. "Trust me, it's the best thing for everyone. Do you know how much those downtown apartments cost? And the insurance liability alone. If she fell or had some kind of episode while living alone, we could be looking at serious legal exposure." Another pause. I set down my teacup with trembling hands. Of course she doesn't know about the inheritance implications. Why would she? She's never been good with financial planning. That's why Harold always handled everything. Bradley's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "She's becoming a real burden, honestly.
This way, she gets professional care, and we get peace of mind. Plus, the facility has an excellent track record with, well, let's just say they're very understanding about family dynamics and estate planning. I'd backed away from the window then, my heart hammering against my ribs. Estate planning? Legal exposure? Financial implications? I wasn't being protected. I was being managed, warehoused, removed from any position where I might interfere with whatever plans Bradley had made for my future. The cruel efficiency of it took my breath away. How long had he been planning this? How many conversations had he had with lawyers and financial advisors discussing me as if I were already gone? I was healthy, alert, capable of making my own decisions. But apparently, my comfort and dignity were less important than his peace of mind and whatever financial benefits my removal would provide. That night, I'd lain awake in what would soon be my former bedroom, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand when my relationship with my son had become so transactional. When had I stopped being his mother and started being his liability? The memories flooded back unbidden. Late nights when he was sick as a child, the pride I'd felt at his medical school graduation, the way he used to seek my advice about everything from career decisions to relationships. Harold and I had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities, to support his dreams. We'd celebrated every achievement as if it were our own, because in many ways it was. But somewhere along the way, success had changed him. The idealistic young man who'd entered medicine to help people had evolved into someone who saw problems to be solved and risks to be managed, even when that problem was his own mother. Now, sitting in the Meadowbrook waiting room, I watched other families navigate the same transition. Some children were tearful, clearly struggling with guilt and grief over circumstances that had forced impossible choices. Others were businesslike, efficiently processing paperwork while their elderly parents sat silent and bewildered. And a few, like Bradley, were simply absent, having delegated even this final transition to administrative staff. Susan returned with my room assignment and a cheerful aide named Marcus who would help me settle in. Room 237, she explained, had a lovely view of the gardens and was close to the activity center. I would love it here, she was certain. The staff was wonderful, the food was excellent, and there were so many opportunities to make new friends. I smiled and nodded at appropriate moments, playing the role of the grateful elderly woman who understood that this was all for the best. But inside, something was crystallizing. A cold, clear understanding that this wasn't about my well-being at all. This was about Bradley's convenience, his risk management, and his financial planning. I was being stored away like a piece of furniture he no longer had room for. Marcus wheeled my single bag down the polished corridor, chatting pleasantly about the facility's amenities. The walls were painted in soothing pastels, decorated with generic artwork designed to be calming and inoffensive. Everything was clean, professional, carefully designed to be reassuring. But it felt like a beautifully appointed prison. Room 237 was exactly as advertised. Clean, comfortable, with a view of well-maintained gardens where other residents walked slowly along paved paths or sat on benches feeding birds. A narrow bed, a small dresser, a chair by the window. Everything I needed, but nothing I wanted.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The dining room serves dinner at 5, Marcus explained, showing me the meal schedule posted inside the closet door. And there's bingo tonight at 7 in the main lounge. Mrs. Patterson in 241 is originally from Chicago too. I'm sure you'll have lots to talk about. After he left, I sat on the bed and looked around my new world. 37 square feet of existence, measured and allocated like a storage unit. Through the thin walls, I could hear a television playing a game show, someone coughing, the distant sound of institutional life settling into its evening rhythm. I opened my journal and began to write, as I had every day for 3 decades. But tonight, the words came slowly, weighted with a realization I was only beginning to understand. Bradley had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd seen his aging mother as a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, a potential liability to be contained.
What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about, was exactly who he'd just locked away in this pleasant, professional prison. He'd assumed, as he always did, that he understood everything important about my life, that Harold had handled all the finances, that I'd been a passive observer to our family's business dealings, that I was exactly as helpless and dependent as I appeared. But there were things about my life, about my work, about the quiet empire I'd spent 40 years building that Bradley had never bothered to learn. He'd seen the volunteer work and the bridge games, the simple apartment and the modest lifestyle, and assumed that was the full picture. He'd never asked about the foundation board meetings I attended, the investment portfolio I managed, or the hospital system that still bore my maiden name in its corporate structure. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand just how thoroughly he'd underestimated the woman he'd just discarded. And eventually, he would too. The dinner bell chimed softly down the hall, and residents began shuffling toward the dining room. I closed my journal, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to meet my new neighbors. But this was not surrender. This was reconnaissance. Because Margaret Ellen Crawford had not built a healthcare empire by accepting other people's definitions of what she could and couldn't do, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. The first week at Meadowbrook passed in a blur of scheduled activities and institutional rhythms. I attended the mandatory orientation sessions, learned the meal times, and smiled politely at the staff who spoke to me in the gentle, patronizing tones reserved for the elderly. But while my body went through the motions of settling in, my mind was traveling back through decades of memories that Bradley had never bothered to understand. It started in 1982, 3 years after Harold and I were married. He was completing his residency at Northwestern Memorial, working brutal hours for barely enough money to cover our tiny apartment near the hospital. I was 28, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in healthcare administration that I'd earned while working full-time as a medical records clerk. Most doctors' wives in those days focused on supporting their husbands' careers, hosting dinner parties, and managing households. I had different plans. "There's a small clinic going bankrupt on the South Side," I'd told Harold over breakfast one morning, spreading financial documents across our kitchen table. Harold had looked up from his medical journals, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Margaret, we barely have enough to pay our own bills. Why would we want to take on someone else's debt?" But I'd already run the numbers. The clinic served a low-income neighborhood that had been abandoned by most healthcare providers. The previous owner had failed because he'd tried to run it like a traditional private practice. But I saw something different. With proper management, community partnerships, and a focus on preventative care, it could be profitable while actually serving people who needed help. "Because it's not just a clinic," I'd explained, pointing to the demographic studies I'd compiled. "It's a proof of concept. If we can make healthcare work in an underserved community, we can replicate that model anywhere." Harold had been skeptical, but he trusted my business instincts. We'd pooled our savings, taken out a loan that terrified us both, and bought our first property. I handled the administrative side while Harold provided medical oversight between his residency shifts. We hired 2 nurse practitioners, a social worker, and a part-time physician's assistant. Instead of competing with established practices, we focused on services that others ignored: addiction counseling, women's health, pediatric care for families without insurance. The first year nearly broke us. I worked 18-hour days, learning everything from medical billing to facilities management to community outreach. I attended city council meetings, built relationships with local churches and schools, and slowly convinced a neighborhood that had been failed by the healthcare system that we were different. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Rodriguez brought her diabetic son to us after he'd been turned away from 2 emergency rooms because they couldn't pay up front. Elena Martinez, our nurse practitioner, not only treated the boy, but connected the family with insulin assistance programs and diabetes education resources. Word spread. Within 6 months, we had a waiting list. By 1985, we'd opened a second clinic, then a third. Each one followed the same model: identify underserved communities, provide comprehensive care, build trust through consistency and respect. Harold finished his residency and joined the practice full-time, but he focused on patient care while I handled the business expansion. The real turning point came in 1987 when Chicago's city government approached us about managing healthcare services for municipal employees. The existing system was bloated, inefficient, and expensive. I proposed a comprehensive managed care model that would save the city millions while improving outcomes. The contract was worth $12 million over 5 years.
Suddenly, we weren't just running community clinics, we were healthcare administrators for thousands of people. The success led to contracts with 3 major corporations, 2 school districts, and eventually the county health system. Each contract taught me something new about scale, efficiency, and the complex web of relationships that drove healthcare economics. But I never forgot the lesson from that first clinic. Healthcare wasn't just about medicine. It was about understanding people, communities, and systems. It was about seeing connections that others missed and building solutions that worked for everyone involved. By 1990, Crawford Community Health Services employed over 200 people across 12 locations. We'd pioneered innovative programs in addiction treatment, maternal health, and chronic disease management. Healthcare journals wrote articles about our model. Medical schools invited me to speak about healthcare administration. But to Harold's colleagues, I was still just Dr. Mitchell's wife who helps with the business side. I didn't mind the invisibility. It gave me freedom to operate without the scrutiny that came with public recognition. While other healthcare executives fought for media attention and industry awards, I focused on building infrastructure. I acquired struggling practices, converted them to our model, and integrated them into a growing network. I developed relationships with insurance companies, pharmaceutical suppliers, and medical equipment manufacturers. I learned to navigate regulatory systems, negotiate contracts, and manage cash flow across multiple entities. The most important decision came in 1993, when I suggested we incorporate as a for-profit entity rather than remaining a collection of independent practices. Harold was resistant. He'd gotten into medicine to help people, not to build a business empire. But I could see where healthcare was heading. Consolidation was inevitable. Independent practices would either join larger systems or be driven out of business by economies of scale. We can help more people if we're financially stable, I'd argued, and we can do it on our own terms instead of being acquired by some corporation that doesn't share our values. Crawford Health Systems was incorporated with me as Chief Executive Officer and Harold as Chief Medical Officer. Most people assumed Harold was the real power behind the company. He was the doctor, after all, and this was the era when women executives in healthcare were still rare. I encouraged that assumption. It protected me from competitors who might have seen me as a threat and gave me room to make strategic moves without attracting unwanted attention. The 1990s were a period of explosive growth. We acquired 3 small hospitals, expanded into urgent care centers, and developed specialized treatment facilities for mental health and addiction recovery. We pioneered outpatient surgery centers and diagnostic imaging facilities. By 1999, Crawford Health Systems was the 3rd largest healthcare provider in Illinois, with over 3,000 employees and annual revenues exceeding $400 million. But the real innovation wasn't in size, it was in approach. While other hospital chains focused on maximizing profits from wealthy patients, we maintained our commitment to serving diverse communities. We cross-subsidized care, using profits from affluent areas to support services in low-income neighborhoods. We invested in preventive programs that reduced long-term costs. We treated healthcare as a public good that happened to operate through private enterprise. The strategy worked brilliantly. Our patient satisfaction scores consistently ranked in the top 5% nationally. Our employee retention rates were the highest in the industry. Our financial performance attracted investment offers from major healthcare corporations who wanted to acquire us, but I always declined. We were building something different, something that couldn't be replicated through acquisition. Harold's role in the company was crucial but limited. He provided medical oversight, ensured clinical quality, and served as the public face of our physician recruitment efforts. But the strategic direction, the business development, the complex negotiations that shaped our growth, those were my domain. I made decisions that affected thousands of employees and hundreds of thousands of patients. I managed budgets larger than many city governments.
I navigated regulatory challenges that could make or break entire healthcare systems. And yet, to Bradley, I was simply his mother who helped out with Dad's practice. Even after Harold's death in 2015, when I should have naturally assumed public leadership of the company, I chose to maintain the fiction that I was merely a caretaker. The board of directors knew the truth. They'd been working with me for decades. The senior management team understood that major decisions had always flowed through my office. But externally, Crawford Health Systems was still perceived as Harold's legacy, temporarily managed by his widow until the next generation was ready to take over. Bradley had been working as a hospitalist at one of our competitors for 12 years by then. He'd built a solid reputation as a physician, specializing in internal medicine with a focus on geriatric care. Ironically, his expertise was in treating exactly the kind of patients he'd just dismissed his own mother as becoming. I'd offered him positions within Crawford Health Systems several times over the years, but he'd always declined. He preferred the straightforward life of a staff physician, regular hours, clear responsibilities, none of the administrative headaches that came with healthcare management. He'd inherited Harold's dedication to patient care, but none of his business instincts or interest in systemic change. That should have been fine. Not every physician wants to be an administrator. But Bradley's disinterest in the business side had blinded him to realities that would have been obvious to anyone who paid attention. He saw my volunteer work and social activities, but he never asked about the board meetings, the strategy sessions, the regulatory filings, or the investment decisions that occupied most of my time. He knew I'd helped Harold with his practice, but he'd never bothered to understand what that meant. He'd assumed that my involvement was clerical, managing schedules, handling paperwork, organizing social events for the medical staff. The idea that I might have been the architect of the entire system, the strategist behind its growth, the executive responsible for its direction, simply never occurred to him. Now, sitting in my carefully appointed room at Meadowbrook, I realized that Bradley's ignorance wasn't accidental. It was willful. He'd constructed a version of our family history that made him comfortable, where his father was the visionary leader and his mother was the supportive helpmate. Any information that contradicted that narrative was simply ignored or dismissed. But willful ignorance had consequences, and Bradley was about to discover that the burden he'd just institutionalized was not quite the helpless widow he'd imagined. The woman he'd reduced to an overnight bag and a room assignment had spent 40 years building something he'd never taken the time to understand.
The irony was almost perfect. He'd placed me in Meadowbrook because he thought I was becoming too expensive, too risky, too much of a liability to manage on my own. What he didn't know was that Meadowbrook Care Facility was a subsidiary of Crawford Health Systems. He'd essentially placed his mother in her own company's facility. And tomorrow, I would begin to remind the world exactly who Margaret Crawford was. 3 weeks into my stay at Meadowbrook, I'd established what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary routine. Morning exercises in the physical therapy room, lunch with Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Hoffman from down the hall, afternoon reading by the garden window. The staff had begun to relax around me, treating me as just another pleasant elderly resident who caused no trouble and made no demands. They had no idea that I was conducting the most thorough audit of their facility that had ever been performed. During my morning walks through the corridors, I observed staffing patterns, noting which shifts seemed understaffed and which departments appeared to be cutting corners. I listened to conversations between aides, picking up complaints about equipment shortages and administrative policies that interfered with patient care. At mealtimes, I engaged other residents in seemingly casual conversations that revealed concerning patterns about medication management and response times for emergency calls. What I discovered both impressed and troubled me. Meadowbrook was well run compared to industry standards, but it was also operating with the lean efficiency typical of facilities focused more on profit margins than patient experience. The staff genuinely cared about the residents, but they were working within constraints that limited their ability to provide the level of attention that many elderly patients needed. More importantly, I was learning about the subtle ways that institutional life stripped away dignity and autonomy. Small things, like the assumption that residents needed help with tasks they could manage independently,
The way staff members spoke about patients in their presence, as if they weren't fully present or capable of understanding. The rigid schedules that prioritized operational efficiency over individual preferences. These observations weren't just professional interest, they were personal education. Bradley had placed me here believing I belonged in this environment, that I was naturally suited to this diminished existence. Understanding why he'd made that assumption became crucial to planning my response. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Janet Morrison, the facility's assistant director. She'd stopped by during one of my garden walks, checking on my adjustment to life at Meadowbrook. "Your son mentioned you'd been involved in some kind of charity work," she said, settling onto the bench beside me. "We have several volunteer opportunities here if you're interested in staying active." I smiled, maintaining the pleasant demeanor I'd cultivated. I did some work with healthcare organizations over the years, nothing too sophisticated, mostly just helping with fundraising and community outreach. "That's wonderful. We always need help with our family communication programs. Many of our residents feel forgotten by their children, and we try to bridge those gaps whenever possible." The irony was so sharp, it almost made me laugh. Here I was, abandoned by my own son, being asked to help other families maintain connections he'd severed without hesitation. But Janet's comment revealed something else, a perspective on family dynamics that I needed to understand. "Do you find that adult children often struggle with having aging parents?" I asked carefully. Janet's expression grew thoughtful. "It's more common than people want to admit. Adult children today face enormous pressures, career demands, their own families, financial stress, and many of them simply aren't equipped to handle the complex needs of aging parents. They love them, but they don't know how to balance their own lives with caregiving responsibilities." She paused, watching a group of residents feed ducks by the small pond. "The difficult cases are the ones where children convince themselves that institutional care is what their parents want, when really it's what the children need. They project their own anxieties about aging onto their parents and make decisions based on their fears rather than actual assessment of capability." I absorbed this insight carefully. Bradley hadn't just seen me as a burden, he'd seen me as a preview of his own future helplessness. Placing me in Meadowbrook wasn't just about managing my supposed decline, it was about managing his terror of what aging might mean for him. "Of course," Janet continued, "we also see the opposite problem. Adult children who refuse to acknowledge when their parents genuinely do need additional support. They enable dangerous situations because they can't accept that independence isn't always possible or safe." This conversation crystallized something important. Bradley's decision hadn't been entirely malicious. It had been based on genuine fears and limited understanding. He'd seen an aging mother living alone and projected worst-case scenarios without bothering to assess my actual capabilities or consult me about my preferences. In his mind, he was being responsible and proactive. The problem was that his assessment had been completely wrong. That evening, I made my first real move. Using the facility's business center computer during the designated internet time, I logged into the secure portal that connected me to Crawford Health System's executive management system. My access credentials were still active, of course. I was still the company's chairman of the board, even if I'd stepped back from day-to-day operations. The quarterly reports revealed exactly what I'd expected. Crawford Health Systems continued to perform exceptionally well under the management team I'd assembled. Revenues were up 8% over the previous year, patient satisfaction scores remained in the top tier nationally, and employee retention rates exceeded industry averages by significant margins. More relevantly, I reviewed the operational data from Meadowbrook itself. As a subsidiary facility, it generated detailed reports about occupancy rates, staff performance metrics, and financial projections. The numbers told an interesting story. Meadowbrook was profitable, but not exceptionally so. The facility operated on relatively thin margins, typical for elder care facilities that accept Medicare and Medicaid patients alongside private pay residents. The staff-to-patient ratios met regulatory requirements but didn't exceed them. Equipment and facilities were maintained adequately. In other words, Meadowbrook was exactly the kind of operation that could benefit from increased investment and improved management protocols. It was well-run, but constrained by the financial realities of elder care in America.
I spent the next hour reviewing personnel files, operational procedures, and strategic planning documents. Then I opened a new document and began typing a memo that would eventually change everything. But not yet. The timing had to be perfect. Over the following days, I continued my careful observation while beginning to test small boundaries. I started declining certain scheduled activities, explaining that I preferred to read during those times. I asked for modifications to my meal schedule, citing digestive concerns that were perfectly plausible for someone my age. I requested permission to receive visitors in the private conference room rather than the general visiting area, claiming that large groups made me anxious. Each request was reasonable, medically justified, and completely accommodated by the staff. But collectively, they established a pattern of someone who was capable of making decisions about her own care and comfortable advocating for her preferences. I also began building relationships with key staff members, not through the superficial pleasantries typical of resident interactions, but through substantive conversations about their professional experiences and observations about healthcare delivery. Maria Santos, the head nurse, had worked in emergency medicine before transitioning to long-term care. During a conversation about medication management, she mentioned her frustration with insurance protocols that prioritized cost savings over optimal treatment outcomes. The system is designed to minimize expenses rather than maximize wellness, she said, reviewing my evening medications. We do the best we can within those constraints, but it's not always what's ideal for patients. I nodded sympathetically. Have you ever worked in systems that operated differently? I've heard there are some healthcare networks that prioritize patient outcomes over profit margins, but I've never seen one personally. Most facilities are owned by large corporations that care more about quarterly reports than quality metrics. I filed this information away carefully. Maria was exactly the kind of dedicated professional who would thrive in an environment with different priorities and more resources. Dr. Patricia Wells, the facility's medical director, provided even more valuable insights during my weekly health assessment. She'd trained at Johns Hopkins and completed her residency in geriatric medicine at Mayo Clinic before accepting her current position. "What drew you to elder care?" I asked during one of our sessions. "I wanted to focus on quality of life rather than just treating acute conditions," she explained. "Geriatric medicine is about helping people maintain dignity and autonomy as they age, not just managing their medical problems. Do you feel like you're able to achieve that here?" Dr. Wells hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Meadowbrook is a good facility with caring staff, but the healthcare industry doesn't always reward the kind of comprehensive, patient-centered approach that would be ideal for this population. Another valuable perspective. Dr. Wells understood the limitations of her current environment and had clear ideas about what better care might look like. By the end of my 4th week at Meadowbrook, I'd assembled a complete picture of the facility's operations, capabilities, and constraints. I'd identified key personnel who shared my values about patient-centered care, and I'd established myself as a pleasant, cooperative resident who presented no management challenges. I'd also confirmed that Bradley had made no effort to visit or even call to check on my adjustment. According to the staff, he'd spoken with the administration once to ensure that my placement had gone smoothly, but he hadn't inquired about my well-being or requested any updates on my condition. His absence was both hurtful and tactically useful. It demonstrated clearly that his concern had been about removing me from his life rather than ensuring my welfare. But it also meant that he had no current information about my activities or state of mind. He assumed I was exactly where he'd left me, diminished, defeated, and safely contained. He was about to learn how wrong assumptions could be. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was having breakfast with Mrs. Patterson. The dining room's gentle hum of conversation was interrupted by Janet Morrison's voice over the intercom. "Margaret Mitchell, please report to the administrative office. You have an important phone call." Mrs. Patterson raised her eyebrows over her coffee cup. "Family emergency?" she asked, with the casual curiosity of someone whose own children rarely called. I smiled reassuringly. Probably just some paperwork from my old apartment. But as I walked down the familiar corridor toward the administrative wing, I knew exactly what this call was about. I'd been expecting it for 3 days. Janet gestured me into her private office and handed me the phone with an expression of professional concern. "It's someone from Crawford Health System's corporate office. They said it was regarding your residency status here."
I accepted the phone with appropriately puzzled confusion. Hello? Mrs. Mitchell? This is David Chen, Director of Strategic Operations for Crawford Health Systems. I apologize for contacting you directly, but we've encountered some irregularities in your file that require immediate clarification. David's voice carried the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering potentially sensitive information. I'd hired him myself 5 years earlier, poaching him from a competitor because of his exceptional analytical skills and his ability to navigate complex regulatory situations with both precision and discretion. I'm not sure I understand, I replied, maintaining the slightly confused persona I'd cultivated. Is there some problem with my insurance coverage? Mrs. Mitchell, our records indicate that you may be more involved with our organization than your current residency application suggests. Could you please confirm your relationship with Crawford Health Systems? I glanced at Janet, who was pretending to organize papers while obviously listening to every word. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the first crack in the carefully constructed narrative that Bradley had created about my capabilities and circumstances. I did some volunteer work with healthcare organizations over the years, I said carefully. Nothing too significant. My late husband Harold was a physician, and I helped with some administrative tasks. There was a long pause. I could almost hear David choosing his words with extreme care.
Mrs. Mitchell, I think there may be some confusion about the scope of your volunteer activities. Would it be possible for you to meet with our legal team? There are some documents that require your personal attention, and they're not the kind that can be handled over the phone. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction. David was being appropriately cautious, not revealing anything that might compromise my position, but making it clear that this conversation needed to happen in person and in private. Of course, I said, though I should mention that my son arranged my placement here, and he might need to be involved in any business discussions. Another pause. Mrs. Mitchell, I think it would be best if we spoke with you directly first. Some of these matters are confidential in nature. Janet was no longer pretending to ignore the conversation. Her professional training in elder care had taught her to recognize when family dynamics were more complicated than they initially appeared, and this phone call was clearly raising red flags. I could arrange for someone to drive you to our downtown office, David continued. Would tomorrow afternoon be convenient, say 2 p.m.? I considered this carefully. Tomorrow would give me time to prepare for what was essentially going to be my first public step back into my actual life. It would also give David and the legal team time to assemble whatever documentation they felt was necessary to handle this situation properly. That would be fine, I agreed. Should I bring anything specific? Just some form of photo identification. We'll handle everything else. After I hung up, Janet studied my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent years reading the subtle signs of family crisis and institutional complications. Mrs. Mitchell, is everything all right? That sounded complex. I sat down in the chair across from her desk, suddenly feeling the weight of the performance I'd been maintaining for over a month. The pleasant, slightly confused elderly woman who needed guidance and protection, the helpless widow who was grateful for her son's intervention, the burden who'd been appropriately managed and contained. Janet, can I ask you something? In your experience, how often do families make decisions about elder care without fully understanding their parents' actual circumstances? She leaned back in her chair, clearly recognizing that this conversation had shifted into deeper territory. More often than anyone wants to admit, adult children often see what they expect to see rather than what's actually there. They project their own fears of aging onto their parents, or they make assumptions based on outdated information. She paused. Sometimes they're protecting themselves from guilt by convincing themselves that they're protecting their parents from risk. And what happens when those assumptions are wrong? Janet's expression grew thoughtful. That depends. Sometimes families recognize their mistake and adjust accordingly. Sometimes they double down on their original decision because admitting error is too psychologically threatening. She studied my face carefully. And sometimes the parent has been concealing capabilities or resources that change the entire equation. I smiled for the first time in weeks with genuine warmth rather than polite performance. You're very perceptive.
It's my job to understand family dynamics. And Mrs. Mitchell, I've been wondering for weeks why someone with your obvious intelligence and competence seemed so resigned to being here. This was the moment of truth. I could continue the charade, maintain the fiction that Bradley had created, and wait to see how the situation with Crawford Health Systems developed. Or I could begin to reveal the reality that he'd been so determined to ignore. Janet, what would you say if I told you that phone call was from my own company? Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem entirely surprised. I'd say that explains a lot about why you've been observing our operations so carefully. The relief of dropping even a small part of the pretense was enormous. For over a month, I'd been forcing myself to accept diminished expectations, to respond to patronizing kindness, to participate in activities designed for people who needed cognitive stimulation and social structure. I'd been living as someone else's definition of who I was supposed to be at 72. Janet, can I ask you something in confidence? If circumstances at Meadowbrook were to change, if resources became available to improve staffing, upgrade equipment, expand programs, would you be interested in being part of that transformation? She stared at me for a long moment, processing implications that were probably far broader than she'd imagined. Mrs. Mitchell, exactly who are you? I stood up, feeling my spine straighten with the authority I'd been hiding for weeks. I'm someone who's been underestimated by her own family, and tomorrow I'm going to begin correcting that misunderstanding. The conversation with Janet marked a turning point, but it also created new complications. By evening, word had spread quietly among the senior staff that something unusual was developing with the pleasant elderly woman in room 237. Not gossip exactly, but the kind of professional awareness that develops when experienced healthcare workers recognize that a situation is more complex than it initially appeared. Dr. Wells stopped by during evening rounds, ostensibly to check on my adjustment to the facility, but clearly fishing for information about the mysterious phone call and administrative meeting. "I understand you have some business to attend to tomorrow," she said, reviewing my chart with unnecessary thoroughness. "Just some paperwork related to my late husband's affairs," I replied. "Nothing too complicated." But Dr. Wells had been working in healthcare long enough to recognize when nothing too complicated actually meant something quite significant. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but in all my years working in elder care, I've never encountered a patient who seemed less suited to institutional living than you do." I looked up from the book I'd been reading. "What do you mean?" "You're clearly intelligent, independent, and capable of managing your own affairs. You participate in our programs politely but without enthusiasm. You follow our routines because you're courteous, not because you need structure." She paused. "You act like someone who's here temporarily rather than someone who's found a new home." Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. I'd been so focused on gathering information and maintaining my cover that I hadn't realized how obvious my disconnection from institutional life had become to trained professionals. "Dr. Wells, what would you think if I told you that my placement here might have been premature?"
I'd think that's more common than most families want to acknowledge. And I'd think that someone in your position might have more options than she's been led to believe. That night, I sat by my window looking out at the garden where I'd spent so many hours observing and planning. Tomorrow's meeting would begin the process of reclaiming my actual life, but it would also force confrontations that I'd been avoiding for weeks. Bradley would eventually learn that his burden was actually the owner of the facility where he'd placed her. He'd discover that the mother he'd dismissed as a liability was actually one of the most successful healthcare executives in the Midwest. He'd realize that every assumption he'd made about my capabilities, my resources, and my future had been completely wrong. But more than that, he'd have to confront the fact that he'd made those assumptions because they were convenient for him, rather than because they were true. The reckoning was about to begin. The Crawford Health System's corporate headquarters occupied 15 floors of a gleaming downtown Chicago high-rise. As the car service pulled up to the entrance, I felt a familiar surge of satisfaction at seeing the modest bronze nameplate that simply read, "Crawford Health Systems, Corporate Offices." No flashy logos or architectural grandstanding, just the quiet confidence of an organization that let its work speak for itself. The lobby had been redesigned since my last visit,
featuring new artwork from local artists and a living wall of plants that created a calming atmosphere. Even in my extended absence, the company continued to reflect the values I'd instilled: professional excellence without ostentation, innovation grounded in human care. Mrs. Mitchell? The young woman approaching me wore a professional smile and carried herself with the crisp efficiency I'd always demanded from our staff. I'm Sarah Kim, executive assistant to Mr. Chen. He's waiting for you upstairs. As we rode the elevator to the 14th floor, Sarah made polite conversation about the weather and the traffic, but I could sense her curiosity. She was probably wondering why a routine administrative matter required this level of attention from senior management. In her position, I would have been equally puzzled.
The executive conference room was exactly as I'd left it. Polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Grant Park, walls lined with awards and recognitions the company had earned over the decades. David Chen stood as I entered, accompanied by two other people I recognized immediately: Patricia Reeves, our chief legal counsel, and Michael Torres, our chief financial officer. "Mrs. Mitchell," David said, his relief evident, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat wherever you're comfortable." I chose the chair at the head of the table, my chair, and watched their faces carefully. Patricia's expression was unreadable, her legal training serving her well. Michael looked distinctly uncomfortable, probably calculating the potential implications of whatever irregular situation had prompted this meeting. "Before we begin," I said, settling into the familiar leather chair, "I want to make something clear. This conversation is confidential until I decide otherwise. Nothing we discuss leaves this room without my explicit permission." David nodded immediately. Of course, we've already had our IT department ensure that this meeting isn't being recorded, and everyone present has signed additional confidentiality agreements. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to clarify your current legal status regarding Crawford Health Systems. Our records show some discrepancies between your official position and your current living situation." I smiled at her careful phrasing. Patricia had always been diplomatic, but she was also thorough enough to have discovered exactly who was living at Meadowbrook Care Facility. "What kind of discrepancies?" Michael opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. "According to our corporate filings, you remain chairman of the board of directors and hold controlling interest in Crawford Health Systems. You also maintain signature authority on all major operational decisions and strategic initiatives." He paused, consulting his notes. "However, according to the intake documentation at Meadowbrook, you were placed there by your son, Bradley Mitchell, who identified himself as your primary caregiver and decision-maker. He also provided medical documentation suggesting cognitive decline that would impact your ability to manage complex financial affairs." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see Patricia's legal mind working through the implications, while David waited for my response with barely contained tension. "Show me the medical documentation," I said quietly. Patricia slid a file across the table. I opened it to find a psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Robert Hensley, a name I didn't recognize. According to his report, I was experiencing mild cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage dementia and depression following spousal loss that impacts decision-making capacity. The evaluation was dated 3 weeks before Bradley had placed me at Meadowbrook. I'd never met Dr. Hensley, never undergone any psychiatric assessment, and certainly never consented to any evaluation of my cognitive abilities. "This is fraudulent," I said, my voice cutting through the room's careful politeness. "I've never met this physician, never undergone this evaluation, and never authorized anyone to conduct psychological assessments on my behalf." Michael's face went pale. "Mrs. Mitchell, if this documentation is false, then your son may have committed fraud to gain access to your medical records and potentially your financial assets." I set the file aside and looked around the table at 3 executives who'd built their careers on my guidance and leadership. They were good people, competent professionals who'd been placed in an impossible position by my son's deception. "David, Patricia, I want you to listen very carefully.
Over the past month, I've been conducting a comprehensive evaluation of our Meadowbrook facility. I've assessed staffing patterns, operational efficiency, patient satisfaction metrics, and compliance protocols. I've also been planning significant changes to our elder care division. Their confusion was obvious. They'd expected to handle a delicate family situation involving their beloved former CEO's declining mental capacity. Instead, they were learning that I'd been working undercover in our own facility. "You've been investigating Meadowbrook?" Patricia asked carefully. "I've been living there. My son placed me there against my will, using fraudulent medical documentation to suggest that I was incapable of independent living." I paused, letting that sink in. He believed he was protecting himself from the liability of an aging mother. What he actually did was place me in a position to conduct the most thorough operational review in our company's history. David's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. "You've been gathering intelligence?" "I've been doing my job," I corrected, "and now I'm ready to implement some significant changes, starting with my living situation and ending with a comprehensive restructuring of how we deliver elder care services." Over the next hour, I outlined everything I'd learned during my month at Meadowbrook. The staffing challenges, the equipment limitations, the regulatory constraints that prevented optimal care delivery. I presented my findings with the same analytical precision I'd used for 40 years in boardrooms and strategy sessions. More importantly, I explained how my experience as a patient had revealed gaps in our approach that no external consultant could have identified. The subtle ways that institutional living stripped away dignity, the impact of rigid schedules on individual autonomy, the psychological effects of being treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "We're going to transform Meadowbrook into a model facility," I announced. "Increased staffing ratios, upgraded equipment, expanded programming that treats residents as active participants rather than passive recipients of care. We're going to prove that elder care can be both profitable and truly patient-centered." Patricia was taking notes rapidly. "The investment required for these changes will be substantial. The return on investment will be even more substantial. We'll attract higher-paying private clients, improve our reputation in the healthcare community, and create a model that we can replicate across our entire elder care division." I paused. "But first, we need to address the immediate legal issues surrounding my placement at Meadowbrook." Michael looked up from his financial calculations. "What do you want us to do about your son?" This was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Bradley had committed fraud, violated my civil rights, and attempted to manipulate my medical records for his own convenience. In any other circumstance, I would have demanded immediate legal action. But he was still my son, and despite everything he'd done, I wasn't ready to destroy his career and reputation over his misguided attempt to manage what he perceived as my declining capabilities. "We're going to handle this carefully," I said. "Bradley needs to understand the magnitude of his mistake without destroying his professional standing unnecessarily. He's a good physician who made terrible personal decisions based on fear and ignorance." I stood up, feeling the familiar authority that came with making difficult decisions that would affect multiple lives and careers. "Patricia, I want you to prepare documentation that exposes the fraudulent nature of Dr. Hensley's evaluation. Research his credentials, his relationship with Bradley, and any financial arrangements that might have influenced his report, but don't file any formal complaints yet. David, I want a full operational plan for the Meadowbrook transformation ready within 2 weeks. Include budget projections, staffing requirements, and timeline for implementation. Michael, prepare a comprehensive financial analysis of what this investment will mean for our elder care division's long-term profitability." I moved toward the door, then turned back to face the 3 executives who just witnessed my transition from supposedly declining elderly patient back to decisive corporate leader. "And schedule a meeting with Bradley for Friday afternoon, here, in this conference room. It's time my son learned exactly who he tried to discard."
As I left the building that had been my professional home for decades, I felt the weight of institutional living lifting from my shoulders. The careful performance of helplessness, the manufactured gratitude for basic human dignity, the pretense that I needed protection from my own decisions, all of it dissolved as I stepped back into the life I'd built and earned. Bradley had tried to write the final chapter of my story, casting me as a burden who needed management rather than a person who deserved respect. Tomorrow, I will begin writing my own ending, and it was going to be very different from what he'd imagined. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of autumn clarity that made Chicago's skyline look like a photograph. I stood at the conference room window, watching pedestrians navigate the sidewalks below, and reflected on how dramatically my perspective had shifted in just 3 days. On Tuesday, I was Margaret Mitchell, a pleasant elderly resident of Meadowbrook Care Facility. Today, I was Margaret Crawford, chairman of the board of Crawford Health Systems, preparing to confront the son who'd tried to erase that identity. David knocked softly and entered. "Mrs. Crawford, your son has arrived. He's in reception with his wife." I'd asked David to use my maiden name during today's meeting, a subtle but important signal that we were operating in professional rather than family territory. Bradley would recognize the significance immediately. Has he been informed about the nature of this meeting? Only that Crawford Health Systems needed to discuss irregularities in his mother's residency status at Meadowbrook. Patricia thought it best to keep the initial explanation vague. I nodded. Patricia's legal instincts were sound. Bradley needed to discover the truth gradually, in a controlled environment where his responses could be carefully observed and documented. "Bring them up in 5 minutes. I want Patricia and Michael present, but have them arrive after Bradley and Jessica are seated. I don't want this to feel like an ambush initially." David left, and I took my position at the head of the conference table. The same chair where I'd made decisions affecting thousands of employees and hundreds of thousands of patients. The same chair where Bradley had never seen me sit because he'd never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. When the conference room door opened, Bradley entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to professional respect. He wore his customary dark suit and carried himself with the authority that came from years as a successful physician. Jessica followed behind him, her designer handbag and perfectly coordinated outfit suggesting she'd dressed for what she expected to be a routine administrative meeting. They both stopped short when they saw me seated at the head of the table. "Mom?" Bradley's voice carried confusion rather than concern. "What are you doing here? You should be at Meadowbrook." I gestured to the chairs across from me. "Please, sit down. We have some things to discuss." Jessica glanced nervously between Bradley and me, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but uncertain about the dynamics at play. Bradley remained standing, his medical training apparently alerting him to irregularities in the situation. "I don't understand," he said. "The facility called and said there were administrative issues that required family input. Why would they bring you here instead of discussing things with me directly?" Before I could respond, Patricia and Michael entered, carrying folders and legal documents. Their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere from family conversation to formal business meeting. "Dr. Mitchell," Patricia said, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism she used for difficult legal situations. "This is Michael Torres, our chief financial officer. Please, take a seat." Now Bradley looked genuinely alarmed. He sat down slowly, his eyes moving between the executives and me, trying to piece together what kind of meeting he'd actually been invited to. "Bradley," I began, my voice calm but carrying an authority I hadn't used in his presence for decades. "We need to discuss the circumstances surrounding my placement at Meadowbrook Care Facility." His face tightened defensively. "Mom, if this is about the quality of care, I researched extensively. Meadowbrook has excellent ratings and—" "This isn't about the quality of care," I interrupted. "This is about the fraudulent medical documentation you used to justify my placement there against my will." The color drained from his face. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, and she stared at her husband with growing horror. Patricia slid the psychiatric evaluation across the table. "Dr. Mitchell, are you familiar with this document?" Bradley picked it up with trembling hands, scanning the pages he'd obviously seen before. His silence stretched uncomfortably long as he realized that his careful planning was unraveling in ways he'd never anticipated. Dr. Hensley is a respected psychiatrist, he finally said, his voice defensive but lacking conviction. Dr. Hensley is a former colleague of yours who lost his license to practice in Illinois 3 years ago due to ethical violations, Patricia replied coolly. He's currently working as a consultant in Indiana, where regulatory oversight is less stringent. His evaluation of Mrs. Crawford is not only medically invalid, but legally fraudulent. Jessica was staring at Bradley with an expression of complete bewilderment. Bradley, what is she talking about? What fraudulent documentation? Michael opened his folder and spread financial documents across the table. Dr. Mitchell, these are your mother's current financial holdings and corporate positions. Perhaps you'd like to review them before we continue this conversation. Bradley's hands shook as he examined the papers. Stock certificates, board appointments, signature authorities, investment portfolios. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, you own all of this?" "I built all of this," I corrected, "over 40 years, while you assumed I was just helping your father with his practice. Crawford Health Systems employs over 8,000 people across 3 states. Our annual revenue exceeds $1.2 billion. Meadowbrook Care Facility, where you placed me, is one of our subsidiary operations." Jessica's face had gone completely white. "Oh my God, Bradley! Oh my God, what did you do?" But Bradley was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just shock, but a kind of fundamental disorientation, as if his entire understanding of reality had been suddenly inverted. "You let me believe," he started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I let you believe what you wanted to believe," I said, "that your mother was a helpless widow who needed your protection and management, that I was becoming a burden who required institutional care, that my financial affairs were simple enough for you to handle through fraudulent medical documentation." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Bradley sat frozen, still clutching the financial documents that proved how completely he'd misunderstood his own family circumstances. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Mitchell, falsifying medical records and using fraudulent documentation to institutionalize a competent adult are serious crimes. In this case, they could result in criminal charges, civil liability, and professional sanctions that would end your medical career." "But," I interjected before Bradley could respond, "we're not here to destroy you. We're here to establish some ground rules for moving forward." Bradley looked up at me with desperate hope. "Mom, I thought I was protecting you. I was worried about your safety, your finances, and your ability to live independently. I never meant to." "You never meant to find out who I actually was," I finished. "You made assumptions based on your own fears and prejudices about aging women. You saw what you expected to see rather than bothering to learn what was actually true." I stood up, feeling the full weight of my authority in this room, where I'd made thousands of decisions that shaped lives and communities. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to publicly acknowledge that your medical assessment was incorrect and that I'm fully capable of managing my own affairs. You're going to provide written documentation to Meadowbrook stating that my placement there was voluntary and temporary. And you're going to participate in family counseling to address the fundamental breakdown in communication that led to this situation." Bradley nodded frantically. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you want. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "Additionally," I continued, "you are going to learn about Crawford Health Systems, not as a passive observer, but as someone who understands what your family has actually built. You're going to spend time in our facilities, meet our staff, and understand our mission. Because if you're going to be my son, you're going to know who your mother actually is." Jessica was crying now, tears of relief and shame streaming down her face.
Mrs. Crawford, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. If we'd known. If you'd known, you would have treated me differently, I acknowledged. But the question is, should my treatment have depended on my financial status? Should elderly people only receive respect and dignity if they happen to be wealthy? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. I looked at Bradley, who was still struggling to process the complete inversion of everything he'd believed about our family dynamics. I'm not doing this to humiliate you, I said more gently. I'm doing this because you need to understand that aging doesn't automatically equal helplessness, and that your fears about your own future don't justify controlling other people's present. Bradley finally met my eyes. Mom, Margaret, I don't know what to call you anymore. You can call me Mom, I said, but you need to remember that I'm also Margaret Crawford, and I've earned the right to make my own decisions about my own life. The meeting concluded with Patricia outlining the legal steps necessary to correct the fraudulent documentation and restore my official autonomy. Michael explained the financial implications of Bradley's actions and the measures we'd taken to protect the company's interests. David discussed the operational changes we'd be implementing at Meadowbrook based on my undercover evaluation. But the real conclusion was simpler and more complex than any legal or financial resolution. Bradley had learned that his mother was not the person he'd imagined her to be, and I had learned that reclaiming my identity meant more than just revealing my professional accomplishments. It meant demanding the respect and dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their age or apparent vulnerability.
As they prepared to leave, Bradley turned back to me one final time. Mom, will you come home? Leave Meadowbrook and come back to your real life? I smiled, but shook my head. Not yet. I have work to finish there first. But when I do leave, it will be my choice, made on my timeline for my reasons. He nodded, understanding finally that control was not his to exercise. The burden, it turned out, had never been me. It had been his assumption that he had the right to define who I was allowed to be. And the story was far from over. The unexpected call came on a crisp October morning while I was reviewing applications for the Crawford Fellowship Program, a scholarship initiative we'd established to support healthcare professionals pursuing advanced training in dignity-centered elder care. Sarah Kim's voice carried an unusual mixture of excitement and disbelief. Margaret, you need to sit down for this one. The Secretary of Health and Human Services is on line 1, something about a Presidential Advisory Committee on Aging Policy. Secretary Amanda Richardson's voice was crisp and professional when I answered. Dr. Crawford, I'm calling to invite you to chair the newly established National Commission on Aging with Dignity. The President has tasked us with developing comprehensive policy recommendations to address the challenges facing America's rapidly aging population. The Commission represented the highest level of recognition that our work had achieved. More importantly, it offered an opportunity to influence federal policy affecting millions of elderly Americans. The scope would be unprecedented, examining everything from Medicare reimbursement structures to housing policies, from family caregiver support to age discrimination in employment. The Commission will have 18 months to develop recommendations for legislative and regulatory changes, Secretary Richardson continued. Given your track record in transforming elder care delivery and your advocacy for dignity-centered approaches, you're the obvious choice to lead this effort. After accepting the appointment, I spent the afternoon considering the magnitude of what we were being asked to accomplish. Federal aging policy had developed piecemeal over decades, creating a complex web of programs that often worked at cross purposes. Medicare incentivized institutional care over aging in place. Social Security disability determinations created cliff effects that penalized partial recovery. Housing assistance programs ignored the specific needs of elderly adults who wanted to remain in their communities. The Commission would need to think systemically about how government policies could support aging with dignity rather than simply managing decline. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive approach that our experience had taught us was necessary for real transformation.
Bradley's reaction to the news was characteristically thoughtful. "Mom, this is the opportunity you've been preparing for your entire career, even when you didn't know it. Everything you learned building Crawford Health Systems, everything you discovered at Meadowbrook, everything you've developed through international work, it all leads to this moment." His observation was more perceptive than he might have realized. The journey from successful healthcare executive to institutionalized patient to global advocate had provided me with perspectives that few policymakers possessed. I understood healthcare delivery from multiple angles, as an administrator managing complex systems, as a patient experiencing care, and as a family member navigating difficult decisions. The Commission's first meeting brought together an extraordinary group of experts: geriatricians and gerontologists, economists and sociologists, disability rights advocates, and family caregivers. But what made the group unique was the inclusion of elderly adults themselves as full voting members rather than token representatives. Dr. James Winters, an 83-year-old retired engineer who had become a passionate advocate for accessible technology, brought decades of experience designing systems that actually worked for their intended users. Maria Santos Chen, 79, had spent her retirement years organizing her community's immigrant elderly population to access services and support. Robert Kim Johnson, 81, was a former civil rights lawyer who now focused on age discrimination issues. "Too often," I told the group during our opening session, "policy is made about elderly adults without including elderly adults. We're going to model a different approach, one that assumes competence and values lived experience alongside professional expertise." The Commission's work unfolded over 18 intensive months, during which we conducted hearings in 12 cities, reviewed thousands of pages of research, and listened to testimony from hundreds of individuals and organizations. What emerged was a comprehensive understanding of how current policies often undermined the very goals they were intended to achieve. Medicare's reimbursement structure, for example, paid for expensive emergency interventions but not for the preventive services that could avoid those crises. Nursing home regulations focused on safety compliance but ignored quality of life measures. Social Security regulations created perverse incentives that discouraged elderly adults from remaining productively engaged in their communities. Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as WHO's Senior Director for Global Aging Policy, participated in several of our hearings via video conference, sharing insights from international systems that had developed more coherent approaches to aging policy. Countries like Denmark and Netherlands have demonstrated that comprehensive aging support doesn't have to be more expensive than fragmented crisis intervention, she explained to the Commission. But it requires thinking about aging as a normal life stage that deserves support, rather than a medical problem that needs treatment. The Commission's hearings revealed stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. In Milwaukee, we heard from Jennifer Walsh, a 68-year-old woman who had been forced to choose between keeping her home and paying for her husband's Alzheimer's care because Medicare didn't cover the community-based services that could have allowed him to remain at home longer. In Phoenix, Robert Martinez testified about his 90-year-old mother who had been repeatedly hospitalized for falls that could have been prevented with simple home modifications, but Medicare wouldn't pay for prevention while it readily covered expensive emergency treatment. But we also heard success stories that pointed toward better approaches. In Portland, Dr. Jennifer Walsh described a community-based program that provided comprehensive support for elderly adults who wanted to age in place, resulting in both better health outcomes and lower costs than traditional institutional care.
In Seattle, a housing cooperative demonstrated how elderly adults could maintain independence while sharing resources and support systems. The model had proven so successful that similar cooperatives were being established in dozens of other cities. These examples became the foundation for our recommendations, which focused on 4 key principles: presuming competence until proven otherwise, supporting aging in place whenever possible, integrating rather than fragmenting services, and measuring success through quality of life rather than just safety metrics.
The Commission's final report, titled Aging with Dignity, a Blueprint for 21st Century Policy, included over 100 specific recommendations for legislative and regulatory changes. But more importantly, it articulated a new vision for how American society could support its aging population. We recommend a fundamental shift from crisis intervention to proactive support, I explained during our final presentation to Congress. Current policy waits for elderly adults to fail and then provides expensive institutional solutions. We propose investing in community-based services that help people succeed in their chosen living situations. The congressional hearing drew unprecedented attention, partly because of the personal dimension that our family story brought to policy discussions. When Representative Maria Gonzalez asked about my own experience with institutional care, I was able to speak from both professional expertise and lived experience. Congressman, I was placed in institutional care against my will by my own son, who used fraudulent medical documentation to override my autonomy. The experience taught me that our current system makes it far too easy for well-meaning family members to make decisions that strip elderly adults of their dignity and independence. The hearing room was unusually quiet as I continued, but that same experience also showed me how institutional care could be transformed to support dignity rather than undermine it. The question isn't whether we need systems to support aging adults. The question is whether those systems will be designed to empower people or control them. Bradley, who was attending the hearing as a member of the Commission's medical advisory panel, provided the family perspective that had been missing from previous policy discussions. As a physician and as a son, I can testify that our current approach to aging creates false choices between safety and autonomy, he told the committee. We've designed systems that assume elderly adults must choose between independence and support, when what they actually need is independence with support. The Commission's recommendations gained momentum through an unexpected alliance between conservative fiscal hawks who recognized the cost savings potential and progressive advocates who championed the dignity and rights focus. Bipartisan support emerged for reforms that would both improve outcomes and reduce long-term costs. 6 months after our final report, Congress passed the Aging with Dignity Act, the most comprehensive reform of aging policy since the creation of Medicare. The legislation included funding for community-based services, support for aging-in-place initiatives, protection against age discrimination in housing and employment, and new safeguards against unwanted institutionalization. But perhaps the most significant provision was the establishment of aging advocacy offices in every state, staffed by professionals trained in dignity-centered approaches and empowered to investigate complaints about age discrimination or violations of elderly adults' autonomy. The personal impact of this work continued to surprise me. During a book signing for my memoir, The Burden That Never Was, a woman approached with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Crawford, your story saved my family," she said. "My daughter was pressuring me to move to assisted living, and I was starting to believe that maybe I really was becoming a burden. Reading about your experience helped me understand that I had the right to make my own decisions about my living situation." Similar conversations occurred at every public appearance. The story that had begun with Bradley's attempt to manage my supposed decline had become a source of empowerment for thousands of elderly adults who were facing their own family pressures and societal expectations. The international impact continued to expand as well. The Crawford model had now been implemented in facilities across 47 countries, adapted to diverse cultural contexts, but maintaining core principles of dignity and autonomy. Each implementation provided new insights into the universal aspects of aging with dignity while respecting cultural differences in family relationships and community support. Dr. Elena Kowalski, who directed our European operations, reported particularly encouraging developments in Eastern European countries that were rapidly aging due to declining birth rates and emigration. Poland and the Czech Republic have embraced dignity-centered care as a way to address both demographic challenges and cultural values about respecting elders, she explained during one of our quarterly international conferences. They've proven that economic necessity and human dignity aren't contradictory goals. The technology initiatives funded by my MacArthur Fellowship were also yielding unexpected innovations. A collaboration with MIT's Age Lab had produced assistive devices that enhanced capability rather than highlighting limitations. Smart home systems provided safety monitoring without sacrificing privacy. Communication technologies helped elderly adults maintain social connections without requiring technical expertise. Most importantly, these technologies were being designed with elderly adults as partners rather than passive recipients. Focus groups led by our commission's elderly members ensured that new products actually met user needs rather than developer assumptions about what elderly people required. Emma, now a college sophomore studying healthcare policy at Northwestern, had become an invaluable bridge between generations in our work. Her research project on intergenerational attitudes toward aging had revealed significant differences in how young adults and elderly adults perceived autonomy, technology, and family responsibility. Grandma Margaret, your generation fought for the right to make your own decisions, she observed during one of our family dinners. My generation has grown up assuming that autonomy is natural, but we need to understand that autonomy has to be protected and supported, especially as people age. Her insight reflected a broader cultural shift that was occurring as our work gained visibility. Younger adults were beginning to question assumptions about aging that previous generations had accepted. They were demanding better options for their own future aging and advocating for their elderly relatives' rights to dignity and choice. The Netflix documentary's global release had amplified these conversations internationally. Subtitled versions had sparked discussions about aging policy in dozens of countries, each grappling with their own demographic transitions and cultural attitudes toward elderly adults. The film's impact extended beyond healthcare into broader conversations about human rights, family relationships, and social responsibility. University courses in sociology, psychology, and public policy began using our story as a case study in how personal crisis could catalyze social change.
As I approached my 80th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Bradley's misguided attempt to protect me from myself. The woman he had tried to silence had become one of the most influential voices in global aging policy. The burden he had tried to manage had become a catalyst for transformation that neither of us could have imagined. But perhaps the most profound change was in our relationship itself. We had evolved from a traditional mother-son dynamic based on assumptions and roles into a Part 7, Transformation and Redemption. 3 months after the confrontation in the Crawford Health Systems boardroom, I stood in the completely renovated community room at Meadowbrook Care Facility, watching residents participate in activities that would have been unimaginable under the old management structure. Eleanor Martinez, who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier following a stroke, was leading a discussion group about financial planning for seniors. Robert Chen, a former engineer, had established a workshop where residents designed assistive devices for fellow patients with mobility challenges. Mrs. Patterson, my former breakfast companion, now served as the facility's resident advocate, ensuring that new arrivals understood their rights and options. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been accomplished through mandate or corporate decree. Real change in healthcare, I'd learned during my months as both patient and executive, required something far more complex, a fundamental shift in how institutions viewed the people they served. The morning Bradley arrived for his weekly visit, part of our family counseling agreement, he found me in the new research library, reviewing patient satisfaction surveys with Dr. Patricia Wells. The numbers told a remarkable story. In just 3 months, Meadowbrook had moved from average industry performance to the top 5% nationally in patient satisfaction, family approval ratings, and staff retention. "Mom," he said, still slightly awkward with the informal address in my professional environment, "do you have a few minutes?" I gestured to the comfortable seating area we'd created near the large windows overlooking the expanded gardens. Dr. Wells excused herself tactfully, gathering her papers with the kind of respectful efficiency that had become standard throughout the facility. Bradley settled into one of the ergonomic chairs we'd installed to replace the institutional furniture that had dominated the common areas. Over the past 3 months, I'd watched him struggle with the cognitive dissonance of seeing his declining mother operate as a decisive executive while simultaneously learning about her decades of healthcare leadership.
The counseling sessions are helping, he said, without preamble. Dr. Franklin thinks we're making progress understanding how family dynamics and professional relationships intersected in ways that neither of us recognized. I nodded. Dr. Franklin, the family therapist we'd been working with, had proven remarkably skilled at helping Bradley examine his assumptions about aging, autonomy, and family responsibility without making him feel like a villain. The process had been painful for both of us, but it was beginning to yield genuine insights. What specifically has been most helpful? I asked. Bradley considered the question carefully. Understanding that my fear of watching you decline wasn't actually about you at all. It was about my own terror of becoming dependent, of losing control over my circumstances. He paused, looking out at the gardens where several residents were working with the horticultural therapist we'd hired. I projected my worst fears onto your situation and convinced myself I was being protective rather than controlling. This was the kind of self-awareness that our counseling sessions had been designed to develop, but more importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how Bradley understood the relationship between aging and autonomy. And what about the professional aspects? I asked. How do you feel about learning that your mother built a healthcare empire while you assumed she was just helping your father with his practice? Bradley's expression grew more complex. That's been harder to process. I keep remembering conversations where you asked about my work, my patients, my career goals, and I realize now that you were speaking from decades of experience in healthcare administration, but I thought you were just being a supportive mother. He stood up and walked to the window, watching residents engaged in activities that challenged every stereotype about institutional elder care. I think the most difficult part is realizing how much I could have learned from you if I'd bothered to ask the right questions. How many problems I encountered in my own career that you could have helped me solve if I'd understood your background. This was something our family counseling had revealed gradually. Bradley's work as a hospitalist had brought him into contact with many of the systemic challenges that I'd spent 40 years addressing: insurance complications, staffing shortages, equipment limitations, and administrative inefficiencies. He'd struggled with these issues in isolation, never realizing that his mother had pioneered solutions to exactly these problems. Bradley, I said gently, the missed opportunities for collaboration aren't the real issue. The real issue is that you made fundamental decisions about my life without consulting me about my preferences, capabilities, or circumstances. He turned back to face me, his expression reflecting the kind of professional humility he'd been developing through our counseling process. I know, and I understand now that my medical training actually made that worse, not better. I was so accustomed to making decisions about patient care that I applied the same paternalistic approach to our family relationship. This insight had emerged during one of our most difficult counseling sessions. Dr. Franklin had helped Bradley recognize that his professional identity as a physician had unconsciously influenced his assumptions about authority and decision-making in personal relationships. He'd been trained to assess, diagnose, and prescribe solutions for people who came to him with problems. Applying that framework to his aging mother had seemed natural and appropriate until he learned that she was actually his professional superior in terms of healthcare leadership experience. But, I said, there's something positive that's emerged from this situation that I want you to understand. Bradley sat back down, clearly curious about what positive outcomes could possibly have resulted from his catastrophic miscalculation. Your placement of me at Meadowbrook, even though it was based on false assumptions and fraudulent documentation, gave me an opportunity to conduct the most comprehensive patient experience in our company's history. The changes we've implemented here aren't just theoretical improvements, they're based on lived experience as someone who was treated as a typical elderly patient.
I gestured toward the activity happening throughout the facility. Every modification we've made, from the furniture to the scheduling to the staffing ratios, reflects insights I could only have gained by experiencing institutional life as a resident rather than as an administrator. Bradley looked around the transformed space with growing understanding. You're saying that my mistake accidentally created an opportunity for innovation? I'm saying that your mistake forced me to experience healthcare delivery from a perspective I'd never had before, and that experience has informed improvements that will benefit thousands of elderly patients throughout our system. This was perhaps the most complex aspect of our family reconciliation. Bradley's actions had been wrong, ethically, legally, and personally. But the unintended consequences had generated insights that were now being applied across Crawford Health System's entire elder care division. "Are you planning to stay here permanently?" he asked. It was a question he'd been avoiding for weeks, but one that needed to be addressed. My continued residence at Meadowbrook had become something of a symbol, both for the staff and residents who'd witnessed my transformation from hidden executive back to visible leader, and for the healthcare industry that was watching our innovative approach to elder care. "No," I said, "but I'm not leaving until we've established sustainable systems that ensure these improvements will continue after my departure." Over the following hour, I explained the comprehensive transition plan I'd developed with our management team. Key staff members like Dr. Wells and Janet Morrison had been promoted to leadership positions with expanded authority and resources. Maria Santos had been appointed as Director of Patient Experience, with responsibility for maintaining the person-centered care standards we'd developed. The financial investment in improved staffing and facilities had been structured to be self-sustaining through improved patient satisfaction and operational efficiency. More importantly, we'd established Meadowbrook as a teaching facility where healthcare professionals from throughout our system could experience patient-centered elder care firsthand. The model we'd developed was being replicated at our other facilities, with modifications appropriate to different communities and patient populations. "And what about us?" Bradley asked as our conversation wound down. "What does our relationship look like going forward?" This was the question I'd been pondering since our confrontation 3 months earlier. Our family dynamic had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of my professional identity and the exposure of his fraudulent actions. We couldn't simply return to the previous relationship where he made assumptions about my capabilities and I accommodated his misconceptions. "That depends," I said, "on whether you're willing to accept that your mother is a competent adult who deserves respect and autonomy regardless of her age." Bradley nodded without hesitation. "I am, absolutely. And it depends on whether you're willing to learn about our family's actual history instead of the version you constructed to make yourself comfortable." "I want to learn everything," he said earnestly, "about the company, about your work, about the decisions you made that I never understood. Then we'll rebuild our relationship based on truth rather than assumptions." But Bradley, this isn't just about us. It's about how society treats aging adults, how families navigate changing capabilities, and how healthcare systems can serve people with dignity rather than just managing their decline. Over the next several weeks, Bradley began spending significant time at various Crawford Health Systems, not as a visiting family member, but as a physician learning about innovative approaches to healthcare delivery. He shadowed our administrators, participated in patient care conferences, and gradually began to understand the complexity of the operation his mother had built. The transformation in his perspective was remarkable. During one of our family counseling sessions, he described his growing appreciation for the business acumen required to manage a healthcare system while maintaining focus on patient outcomes. "I always thought business and medicine were separate things," he told Dr. Franklin, "but Mom showed me that they're completely integrated. You can't provide excellent patient care without understanding insurance systems, regulatory requirements, staffing logistics, equipment procurement, all the things I thought were just administrative details." Dr. Franklin had smiled at this insight. "And how does that change your understanding of your mother's capabilities?" "It makes me realize that she's been operating at a level of professional complexity that I never achieved in my own career, and that my assumptions about her declining abilities weren't just wrong, they were insulting." The family counseling process had also revealed important insights about Jessica's role in the situation. She genuinely believed that supporting Bradley's decision was the right thing to do, but she'd never questioned the medical documentation or asked about my preferences. Her participation in our counseling sessions helped her understand how easily well-intentioned people could become complicit in denying elderly adults their autonomy. "I kept thinking we were being responsible," she'd explained during one session, "but I never asked myself whether responsibility meant taking over your decisions or supporting your ability to make your own decisions." This distinction between protecting someone and controlling them had become central to our family's new understanding of appropriate care for aging relatives. As winter moved towards spring, I began preparing for my transition out of Meadowbrook.
The facility had achieved remarkable success under its new management structure, and the model we'd developed was being implemented throughout our healthcare system. Patient satisfaction scores had improved across all our elder care facilities, staff retention rates had increased significantly, and our approach was attracting attention from healthcare organizations nationwide. But perhaps more importantly, the personal transformation in my relationship with Bradley had created a foundation for honest communication about aging, autonomy, and family responsibility. "Mom," he said, during one of our final counseling sessions, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." I nodded, curious about what question he'd been building up the courage to ask. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me for what I did?"
The question reflected months of genuine self-examination and growing understanding of the impact his actions had on my sense of dignity and autonomy. Dr. Franklin had been working with him to move beyond guilt toward genuine accountability and changed behavior. "Bradley," I said, "forgiveness isn't the right framework for what happened between us. You made decisions based on false assumptions and limited information. You've acknowledged your mistakes, you've worked to understand their impact, and you've committed to different behavior going forward. That's more important than forgiveness." "But do you trust me?" he pressed. "Do you believe that I understand you differently now?" I considered his question carefully. Trust, after such a fundamental breach, couldn't be restored through declarations or promises. It had to be rebuilt through consistent behavior over time. "I trust that you understand the magnitude of your miscalculation," I said. "I trust that you're committed to learning about our family's actual history, and I trust that you'll think more carefully before making assumptions about my capabilities or preferences." "But," I continued, "rebuilding trust will take time, and it will require ongoing demonstration that you see me as Margaret Crawford, not just as your aging mother." The day I finally left Meadowbrook, the entire facility gathered in the main lobby to mark the transition. Residents, staff members, and administrators who'd participated in our transformation initiative shared reflections about what the experience had taught them about aging, dignity, and innovative healthcare delivery. Dr. Wells presented me with a bound collection of patient testimonials describing how the changes at Meadowbrook had improved their quality of life. Janet Morrison announced that the facility had been selected as a national model for patient-centered elder care. Maria Santos revealed that staff satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in the facility's history. But the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Patterson, now thriving in her role as resident advocate, stood to address the gathering. "Margaret taught us something important," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "She taught us that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless, and that needing some assistance doesn't mean losing all autonomy. She showed us that we can accept help while still maintaining dignity, and that institutional living doesn't have to mean institutional thinking." As I left Meadowbrook for the final time, Bradley was waiting in the lobby with a car to drive me to my new apartment, a downtown penthouse I'd purchased that reflected both my professional success and my personal preferences for urban living and cultural access. "Any regrets about leaving?" he asked as we drove through the Chicago streets I'd missed during my months in institutional care. "No regrets about leaving," I said, "but no regrets about the experience either. Sometimes you have to live in a situation to truly understand it." The new apartment was everything Meadowbrook wasn't: spacious, personalized, filled with art and books and the accumulated treasures of a life lived on my own terms. But it also incorporated lessons I'd learned during my institutional experience about aging in place, accessibility, and the importance of community connections. 6 months later, Bradley joined Crawford Health Systems as Director of Clinical Innovation for our elder care division. His medical background, combined with his newfound understanding of healthcare administration and his personal experience with family caregiving challenges, made him uniquely qualified to help develop programs that bridged clinical care and family support services. Our relationship had evolved into something more complex and honest than the traditional mother-son dynamic he'd originally tried to manage.
He consulted me about professional decisions, sought my advice on healthcare policy issues, and included me in family planning discussions as an equal participant rather than a dependent to be managed. But perhaps most importantly, our experience has become a case study used in medical schools and healthcare administration programs throughout the country. The story of an elderly woman who was institutionalized against her will and used that experience to transform eldercare delivery challenged assumptions about aging, autonomy, and family responsibility that pervaded both healthcare training and cultural attitudes toward elderly adults. The burden, as I explained during speaking engagements at healthcare conferences, was never me. The burden was the assumption that aging automatically equals diminished capacity and that family love justifies overriding personal autonomy. A year after leaving Meadowbrook, I received a letter from a woman in Seattle whose adult children had been pressuring her to move to assisted living, despite her preference for remaining in her own home. She'd read about our story in a healthcare journal and wanted to thank me for demonstrating that elderly adults could advocate for themselves even in institutional settings. Your experience gave me courage to insist on my own choices, she wrote, and it helped my children understand that protecting me didn't require controlling me. Similar letters arrived regularly from elderly adults, family caregivers, and healthcare professionals who'd found in our story a framework for navigating the complex challenges of aging with dignity rather than just managing decline. The transformation at Meadowbrook had become permanent and sustainable. The facility consistently ranked among the top eldercare providers nationally, and the model we developed had been replicated successfully at dozens of other facilities throughout our healthcare system. But the personal transformation in my relationship with Bradley had proven equally durable. We'd learned to see each other clearly, he as a competent physician with much to learn about healthcare leadership, and me as an experienced executive who happened to be his aging mother. The burden, it turned out, had never been about my capabilities or his responsibilities. It had been about the assumptions that prevented us from seeing each other as complete human beings deserving of respect, autonomy, and the dignity that comes from being known for who we actually are rather than who others imagine us to be. And in the end, that understanding had transformed not just our family, but an entire approach to aging and healthcare that would benefit thousands of people for years to come. The woman who'd been dismissed as a burden had become the architect of a new model for aging with dignity, and the son who'd tried to manage his mother's decline had learned to celebrate her continued growth.
It was, perhaps, the kind of ending that neither of us could have imagined when this story began. But it was the ending we'd both earned through the difficult work of seeing each other clearly and building a relationship based on truth rather than fear. The burden had been lifted, not by placing it elsewhere, but by recognizing that it had never existed at all. 2 years after my departure from Meadowbrook, I found myself standing before the American Healthcare Association's annual conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address to over 3,000 healthcare executives, administrators, and policymakers. The irony wasn't lost on me. A woman whose own son had tried to silence her voice was now being asked to speak to the entire industry about innovation in elder care. The speech I was about to give had been shaped by countless conversations with residents, families, and staff members who'd experienced the transformation we'd implemented. But it had also been informed by something deeper, the recognition that healthcare delivery at its core was about human dignity, and that dignity couldn't be administered like medication or scheduled like therapy sessions. 5 years ago, I began, looking out at the sea of professional faces. If someone had told me that I would learn the most important lessons of my 40-year healthcare career by becoming a patient in my own facility, I would have questioned their judgment. Today, I'm here to tell you that everything I thought I knew about elder care was incomplete until I experienced it from the other side of the stethoscope. The audience was unusually quiet, clearly aware that this wasn't going to be a typical industry presentation about metrics and cost-effectiveness. How many of you have made decisions about patient care without consulting the patients themselves? How many have assumed that age equals incompetence, that frailty means inability to participate in planning one's own treatment? How many have confused medical necessity with personal autonomy?
Hands remained down, but I could see the uncomfortable recognition in many faces. These were good people, dedicated professionals who'd entered healthcare to help others. But they were also products of a system that had trained them to see elderly patients as problems to be managed, rather than people to be empowered. The Crawford model that we've developed isn't just about improved staffing ratios or better equipment, though those things matter. It's about fundamentally reimagining what it means to provide care to aging adults. It starts with a simple principle. Competence is assumed until proven otherwise, and even when assistance is needed, dignity is non-negotiable. Over the next hour, I detailed the specific innovations we'd implemented across our healthcare system. The family advocacy programs that ensured elderly patients had independent representation in medical decision-making. The cognitive assessment protocols that distinguished between normal aging and actual impairment. The legal safeguards that prevented family members from making unilateral decisions about competent adults. But I also talked about the subtler changes, the way staff members were trained to speak with elderly patients rather than about them, the importance of maintaining personal identity even in institutional settings, the recognition that accepting help in one area didn't mean surrendering autonomy in all areas. The most profound discovery we made, I explained, was that when you treat elderly adults as capable decision makers, they often exceed everyone's expectations, including their own. When you provide appropriate support while maintaining dignity, people thrive in ways that traditional models never anticipated. The response to the presentation was unprecedented. Healthcare executives approached me afterward with questions about implementing similar programs in their own systems. Medical schools requested curriculum consultations to incorporate dignity-centered care into their training programs. Policy researchers wanted to study our outcomes data to inform federal regulations about eldercare standards. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geriatrician from Portland who had been struggling with her hospital's treatment of elderly patients. Dr. Crawford, she said, using the title I'd earned through my decades of healthcare leadership, I've been trying to convince my administration that we need to change our approach to elder care, but they keep focusing on efficiency metrics rather than patient experience. Your model proves that those things don't have to be contradictory. This conversation led to a consulting partnership that would eventually transform how elder care was delivered throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Walsh became one of our most effective advocates for dignity-centered care, implementing pilot programs that demonstrated both improved patient outcomes and enhanced operational efficiency. The consulting work that emerged from my keynote address created opportunities to impact healthcare delivery far beyond Crawford Health Systems. Over the following months, I worked with facilities in 12 states to implement variations of our model, adapting our approach to different communities, populations, and resource levels. Each implementation taught us something new about the relationship between dignity and care delivery. In rural communities, we learned that maintaining connections to familiar environments and relationships was even more crucial than in urban settings. In facilities serving diverse populations, we discovered that cultural competence in elder care required understanding not just medical needs, but generational experiences of discrimination and marginalization. The most challenging implementations were in facilities owned by large corporate chains, focused primarily on profit maximization. These organizations often struggled with the initial investment required to improve staffing ratios and upgrade facilities, even when presented with data showing long-term financial benefits. The problem, explained Robert Martinez, CEO of a facility in Phoenix where we were consulting, is that our board expects quarterly returns, but your model requires investments that pay off over years rather than months. This resistance from profit-driven healthcare corporations led to one of our most significant innovations, the development of financing mechanisms that allowed facilities to implement dignity-centered care improvements through partnerships with philanthropic organizations and government agencies committed to improving elder care quality. The Crawford Foundation, which I established using a portion of my personal wealth, became a key resource for facilities that wanted to transform their approach but lacked the initial capital for necessary improvements. The foundation provided both funding and technical assistance, creating a pathway for systemic change that didn't depend entirely on corporate willingness to prioritize patient dignity over profit margins. Bradley's role in these initiatives had evolved considerably since his initial placement at Meadowbrook. His work as Director of Clinical Innovation had given him firsthand experience with the challenges of implementing patient-centered care in complex institutional environments. His medical background, combined with his growing understanding of healthcare administration, made him an effective advocate for our model within professional medical associations.
The most difficult part of this work, he told me during one of our regular strategy meetings, is helping other physicians understand that admitting uncertainty about patient capabilities is actually better medicine than making assumptions based on age alone. His presentation to the American Medical Association's geriatrics section had been particularly well received, partly because he could speak from personal experience about the dangers of paternalistic decision-making in family caregiving situations. I almost destroyed my relationship with my mother by assuming I knew what was best for her without bothering to ask what she actually wanted, he'd told the assembled physicians. And I'm a doctor who should have known better. How many families are making similar mistakes because we've trained them to see aging as automatic decline rather than normal change? The personal dimension of our story has become an unexpectedly powerful tool for professional education. Medical schools began inviting us to speak together about family dynamics in healthcare decision-making, using our experience as a case study in the importance of patient autonomy and informed consent. These presentations were often emotionally challenging, requiring both of us to revisit the pain and confusion of our initial confrontation. But they were also healing, providing opportunities to transform our family's crisis into education that might prevent similar situations for other families. During one particularly memorable presentation at Johns Hopkins Medical School, a third-year student asked Bradley how he'd learned to see his mother differently. I had to stop seeing her as my aging mother and start seeing her as Margaret Crawford, a person with her own history, capabilities, and preferences, he'd replied. The problem was that I'd constructed an identity for her that made me comfortable rather than learning who she actually was. The student's follow-up question had been even more insightful. How do we train physicians to see patients as complete people rather than collections of symptoms and risk factors? This question had led to the development of what we now called dignity-centered medical education, training programs that emphasized patient autonomy, cultural competence, and the recognition that medical expertise didn't automatically confer authority over personal decision-making. The implementation of these educational programs across multiple medical schools created a new generation of healthcare professionals who understood that good medicine required not just clinical competence, but also respect for patient dignity and autonomy. 3 years after leaving Meadowbrook, I received an invitation that surprised even me. The World Health Organization wanted me to lead an international initiative on dignity-centered elder care. The invitation came from Dr. Sarah Chen, WHO's Director of Aging and Health, who had been following our work through professional publications and conference presentations. Dr. Crawford, she explained during our initial video conference, the demographic changes happening globally mean that every healthcare system will need to reimagine how they serve aging populations. Your model provides a framework that could be adapted for different cultural and economic contexts. The WHO initiative would involve working with healthcare systems in 15 countries to develop culturally appropriate approaches to dignity-centered elder care. Each country presented unique challenges, from resource limitations in developing nations to deeply ingrained cultural attitudes about aging and family responsibility in more traditional societies. The project required extensive travel and collaboration with healthcare professionals, government officials, and community leaders, who often had very different perspectives on aging, autonomy, and family obligations. But it also provided opportunities to learn how universal principles of human dignity could be expressed through diverse cultural practices and institutional structures. In Japan, we learned how to maintain respect for elderly wisdom while still supporting individual choice. In Sweden, we explored how comprehensive social services could enhance rather than replace personal autonomy. In Kenya, we discovered how community-based care could provide support while preserving cultural connections and family relationships.
Each international collaboration reinforced the fundamental insight that had emerged from my experience at Meadowbrook. Dignity wasn't a luxury that only wealthy healthcare systems could afford, but a basic requirement for effective care delivery in any context. The most rewarding aspect of the international work was seeing how healthcare professionals in different countries adapted our model to address their specific challenges while maintaining core principles of patient autonomy and dignity. Dr. Maria Santos, who had been promoted to Vice President of International Operations for Crawford Health Systems, became our primary liaison for the WHO initiative. Her background as a frontline nurse, combined with her experience implementing our model at Meadowbrook, made her uniquely qualified to help other healthcare systems understand both the practical and philosophical dimensions of dignity-centered care. The thing that translates across all cultures, she observed after visiting facilities in 8 countries, is that elderly people want to be seen as individuals with their own stories, preferences, and capabilities. The specific ways you honor that vary, but the fundamental need is universal. As the WHO initiative entered its second year, we began documenting outcomes that demonstrated the global applicability of dignity-centered elder care. Facilities that had implemented our model, adapted for their local contexts, showed consistent improvements in patient satisfaction, family approval ratings, and staff retention, regardless of their geographic location or resource levels. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the development of international standards for elder care that prioritize dignity and autonomy alongside medical treatment. These standards, adopted by healthcare systems in over 30 countries, represented a fundamental shift in how aging adults were perceived and treated within institutional settings. The ripple effects of this work extended far beyond healthcare facilities. Government agencies began revising policies about competency assessments and family decision-making authority. Legal systems started recognizing the rights of elderly adults to make their own choices about living arrangements and medical treatment. Insurance programs expanded coverage for services that supported aging in place rather than just institutional care. On a personal level, the international work had provided Bradley and me with opportunities to travel together, sharing our expertise while continuing to strengthen our rebuilt relationship. These trips revealed new dimensions of our partnership as we learned to collaborate professionally while maintaining appropriate boundaries between our family and business relationships. Working with you has taught me something unexpected, Bradley told me during a flight back from a consultation in Australia. I always thought that professional success meant independence from family influence. But watching you work, I've learned that integrating personal values with professional expertise can actually make someone more effective, not less. This observation reflected a maturity in his thinking that had developed through our years of family counseling and professional collaboration. He'd learned to see our family connection as a source of strength rather than a limitation on his autonomy.
As I approached my 75th birthday, 5 years after Bradley had placed me at Meadowbrook, I found myself reflecting on how completely our family dynamics had been transformed. The son who had once seen me as a burden now sought my advice on complex professional challenges. The mother who had once accommodated his misconceptions now expected him to engage with her actual identity and capabilities. But more importantly, our personal transformation had contributed to systemic changes that would benefit thousands of elderly adults and their families for generations to come. The crisis that had begun with Bradley's fraudulent placement of me in a care facility had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how society understood aging, autonomy, and family responsibility. The final validation of our work came in the form of recognition I had never sought but deeply appreciated. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded for transformative contributions to healthcare delivery and advocacy for the dignity and rights of aging Americans. Standing in the White House Rose Garden, surrounded by other recipients who had dedicated their lives to public service, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had begun with betrayal and institutional confinement, but it had led to innovations that were improving lives around the world. The burden that Bradley had tried to manage by placing me in Meadowbrook had never existed. What had existed was his fear of aging, his assumptions about elderly women, and his unwillingness to see me as a complete person deserving of respect and autonomy.
In transforming those assumptions, we had discovered something far more valuable than either of us had imagined. A new model for aging with dignity that honored both individual autonomy and family love, that balanced necessary support with personal freedom, and that recognized the ongoing capacity for growth and contribution throughout the entire human lifespan. The woman who had been dismissed as a burden had become a catalyst for change that would benefit countless others, and the son who had tried to manage his mother's decline had learned to celebrate her continued capacity for innovation and leadership. It was a legacy neither of us could have imagined when the story began, but it was the legacy we had earned together through the difficult work of seeing each other clearly and building a relationship based on truth, respect, and mutual recognition of each other's full humanity. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office as I reviewed the quarterly reports from Crawford Health System's global operations. At 77, I maintained a schedule that would challenge executives half my age, but the work energized rather than exhausted me. Each report represented lives improved, families empowered, and healthcare systems transformed through principles we'd discovered during my darkest period at Meadowbrook. Jessica knocked softly and entered, carrying the tablet that had become essential for managing my increasingly complex international schedule. Over the years, she had evolved from Bradley's apologetic wife into a key member of our family foundation's leadership team, her background in nonprofit administration proving invaluable as we expanded our dignity-centered care initiatives. Margaret, the documentary crew from Netflix arrives at 10, she reminded me, settling into the chair across from my desk. They want to film the interview segment where you discuss the moment you realized Bradley's placement wasn't about your needs, but his fears. The documentary project had been 3 years in development, chronicling not just our family's transformation, but the broader movement toward dignity-centered elder care that had emerged from our initial crisis. The producers had interviewed hundreds of families, healthcare professionals, and policymakers, creating a comprehensive examination of how society's attitudes toward aging were shifting. "Have they finished editing the footage from Meadowbrook?" I asked, curious about how they'd captured the facility's continued evolution. "Yesterday. They spent a week there, interviewing residents and staff about the long-term impact of the changes you implemented. Mrs. Patterson was particularly eloquent about how the experience taught her to advocate for herself rather than simply accepting institutional limitations. Mrs. Patterson, now 86, had become something of a celebrity within the elder care advocacy community. Her transformation from passive resident to confident self-advocate has inspired similar changes in hundreds of other elderly adults who've heard her speak at conferences and community events." The documentary would also feature Dr. Patricia Wells, who had left Meadowbrook to establish a consulting practice specializing in dignity-centered care implementation. Her work has helped transform over 200 elder care facilities across North America, each adapting our model to their specific communities and populations. "The interview footage with Bradley is remarkable," Jessica continued. "Watching him explain how his medical training had actually hindered his ability to see you as a complete person, it's going to help a lot of healthcare professionals recognize their own blind spots." Bradley's willingness to examine his mistakes publicly had become one of the most powerful tools for professional education within the medical community. His presentations at medical conferences consistently drew standing ovations, not for celebrating his actions, but for his honesty about the dangers of paternalistic assumptions in healthcare delivery. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Sarah Kim's voice came through the speaker with barely contained excitement. "Margaret, I have Dr. Elizabeth Harrison from the MacArthur Foundation online too. She's calling about your nomination for the Genius Grant." I exchanged glances with Jessica, who raised her eyebrows in surprise. The MacArthur Fellowship is typically awarded to artists, scientists, and social innovators whose work showed exceptional creativity and potential for future contribution. At 77, I would be among the oldest recipients in the program's history. "Dr. Crawford," Dr. Harrison's voice was warm but professional, "I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected as a MacArthur Fellow for your transformative work in elder care innovation and dignity-centered healthcare delivery. The foundation recognizes that your approach to aging and autonomy has fundamentally changed how society understands the capabilities and rights of elderly adults. The conversation that followed detailed the fellowship's requirements and opportunities. The financial support would allow me to pursue new research initiatives without institutional constraints. But more importantly, the recognition would amplify the reach of our dignity-centered care message to audiences who might not otherwise encounter it.
After ending the call, I sat quietly for a moment, contemplating how far we'd traveled from that terrible day when Bradley had driven me to Meadowbrook with a single overnight bag and a folder of fraudulent medical documents. The woman he'd tried to silence was now being recognized as one of the most innovative thinkers in American healthcare. "There's something poetic about this," Jessica observed. "Bradley tried to institutionalize you because he thought you were becoming a burden to society. Now, society is recognizing you as one of its most valuable contributors." The irony wasn't lost on me, but it also highlighted the broader transformation that had occurred in public understanding of aging and capability. The cultural narrative that equated advancing age with declining value was being challenged by a growing movement of elderly adults who refused to accept diminished expectations. The MacArthur recognition would fund several initiatives I'd been developing, including a research project examining how ageism in healthcare affected treatment outcomes for elderly patients. Preliminary studies suggested that physicians' assumptions about patient capability significantly influenced the quality and comprehensiveness of care provided, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where elderly patients received less aggressive treatment and consequently experienced worse outcomes. More ambitious was a planned collaboration with technology companies to develop assistive devices that enhanced independence rather than highlighting limitations. Too often, products designed for elderly consumers emphasize their disabilities rather than supporting their remaining capabilities. Our research aimed to create technologies that preserved dignity while providing necessary assistance. The afternoon brought a video conference with healthcare ministers from 6 European countries who were implementing variations of our dignity-centered care model within their national health systems. Each country had adapted our approach to fit their cultural contexts and resource constraints, but all reported similar improvements in patient satisfaction and clinical outcomes. Minister Helena Andersson from Sweden shared particularly encouraging data from their pilot programs. "We've seen a 30% reduction in emergency room visits among elderly patients in facilities using your model, primarily because residents feel empowered to communicate health concerns before they become critical issues." Dr. François Dubois from France reported similar results. "The most unexpected outcome has been improved family relationships. When elderly parents feel respected and autonomous within care settings, their adult children experience less guilt and stress, leading to more positive interactions during visits." These international collaborations had revealed that dignity-centered care wasn't just an American innovation, but a universal human need that transcended cultural boundaries. The specific practices varied. Japanese facilities emphasized different aspects of respect than Swedish ones, but the core principle remained constant: treating elderly adults as capable individuals deserving of autonomy and dignity. The evening brought a family dinner that had become a monthly tradition since Bradley and I had rebuilt our relationship. He arrived with his teenage daughter Emma, who was considering a career in healthcare administration after witnessing the impact of our work on her grandmother's life. "Grandma Margaret," Emma said, using the formal name that acknowledged both our family connection and my professional identity, "I've been reading about your MacArthur Fellowship for a school project. Can I interview you about how you turned such a terrible experience into something positive?" Emma's question reflected a maturity that impressed me. At 16, she understood that transformation didn't happen automatically. It required intentional effort to extract meaning and purpose from difficult experiences. The key, I told her, was recognizing that Bradley's actions weren't really about me. They were about his fears and assumptions about aging. Once I understood that, I could focus on addressing the systemic problems that made his mistakes possible, rather than just feeling hurt by his decisions. Bradley, who had been listening quietly, added his perspective. "The hardest part for me was accepting that my good intentions didn't justify my actions. I had to learn that caring about someone means respecting their autonomy, not controlling their choices." Emma took careful notes, clearly preparing for a sophisticated analysis of how personal crises could catalyze social change.
Her questions revealed an understanding of complex family dynamics that would serve her well if she chose to pursue healthcare administration. What advice would you give to other families dealing with aging and independence issues? She asked. Start with conversation instead of assumption, I replied. Too many families make decisions about elderly relatives without ever asking what those people actually want or need. And remember that accepting help in one area doesn't mean surrendering autonomy in all areas. Bradley nodded in agreement. Medical training teaches us to identify problems and prescribe solutions, but family relationships require negotiation and compromise. I had to learn that being a good son meant supporting mom's decisions, not making decisions for her. The conversation continued through dinner, touching on topics that ranged from healthcare policy to personal relationships. Emma's questions helped all of us articulate insights that had developed gradually through years of family counseling and professional collaboration. After dinner, Bradley and Emma joined me on the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched toward the horizon, each one representing lives being lived with varying degrees of dignity, autonomy, and support. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made such a terrible mistake? Bradley asked, a question that had emerged occasionally during our reconciliation process. I think about it sometimes, I admitted, but I've come to believe that the crisis was necessary for both of us. You needed to confront your assumptions about aging and authority. I needed to experience healthcare delivery from a patient's perspective. Neither of us would have chosen that path, but it led to insights that wouldn't have emerged otherwise. Emma looked thoughtful. So you're saying that sometimes good things come from bad experiences? I'm saying that meaning can be created from suffering, but only through intentional effort to transform pain into purpose, I clarified. Bradley's actions caused real harm, but our response to that harm created positive change that benefits thousands of people.
The conversation reminded me of similar discussions I'd had with families around the world who were struggling with aging, independence, and care decisions. The specifics varied, but the underlying tensions were remarkably consistent. Adult children torn between protection and control, elderly parents fighting to maintain dignity while accepting necessary help, healthcare systems designed for efficiency rather than individual autonomy. Our story had become a template for navigating these challenges, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that families could recover from serious mistakes through honest communication, professional guidance, and mutual commitment to seeing each other clearly. The following week brought news that the Netflix documentary would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival before its global release. The producers had titled it The Burden That Never Was, capturing both the personal dimension of our story and its broader implications for society's treatment of aging adults. Early reviews praised the film for avoiding both sentimentality and oversimplification, instead presenting a nuanced examination of how well-intentioned people could cause significant harm through unexamined assumptions and how families could rebuild relationships after fundamental breaches of trust. More importantly, the documentary was already generating discussions about healthcare policy, family dynamics, and aging that might not otherwise have occurred. Preview screenings had prompted conversations among viewers about their own family situations and assumptions about elderly relatives. The film's impact extended beyond entertainment into education and advocacy. Medical schools were scheduling screenings for students and faculty, using our story as a case study in the importance of patient autonomy and the dangers of paternalistic decision-making. Policy organizations were hosting panel discussions about how to protect elderly adults from well-meaning but harmful family interventions. Perhaps most significantly, the documentary was encouraging elderly adults themselves to speak up about their experiences with ageism, institutional living, and family relationships. The silence that had allowed Bradley's assumptions to go unchallenged was being broken by thousands of voices sharing their own stories of dignity preserved or denied. As I prepared for another international speaking engagement, this time in South Africa, where healthcare systems were grappling with rapid demographic changes, I reflected on how our personal crisis had evolved into a global movement for dignity-centered aging. The woman Bradley had tried to silence at 72 was now, at 77, being heard around the world. The burden he had attempted to manage had become a force for transformation that neither of us could have imagined. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the relationship we had built together, not the traditional mother-son dynamic he had tried to control,
but a partnership based on mutual respect, professional collaboration, and honest recognition of each other's capabilities and limitations. It was a relationship that honored both family love and individual autonomy, that balanced necessary care with personal dignity, and that demonstrated that even the most serious mistakes could become opportunities for growth and positive change. The burden that never was had become a gift that kept giving to our family, to the healthcare industry, and to elderly adults around the world who deserved to age with dignity rather than merely exist under management. And the story was far from over. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.